"Ma'am, the service staff entrance is around the back. You can't come through here." Lieutenant Miller's voice was a practiced blend of politeness and absolute authority. He was young, his face still holding the earnestness of the academy. His uniform so new it seemed to hum with pressed perfection. He stood directly in the path of Helen Brooks, a woman who seemed to be his complete opposite in every conceivable way. Helen was old, her long silver-gray hair pulled back in a simple no-nonsense bun. Wrinkles mapped a life of deep smiles and deeper concentration around her clear, steady eyes. She wore bright red janitorial coveralls, the fabric faded and soft from 1,000 washings, and in one hand she held a long-handled push broom, its bristles worn but clean. She didn't move. She simply stood there, her posture impossibly straight, her presence a quiet, unyielding stone in the rushing river of elegantly dressed guests. "I'm here for the graduation," she said, her voice low and even, without a trace of defensiveness. Miller's polite smile tightened at the edges. He glanced at her broom, then back at her face. "I understand," he said, his tone shifting to one used for a confused child, "but this area is for guests and graduates' families. The staff muster point is by the loading docks. I can have someone show you." He was trying to be helpful, to resolve the dissonant image she presented. An old woman in a janitor's uniform did not belong in the main hall. It was a simple, observable fact, a disruption to the meticulously planned order of the day. "I am a guest," Helen repeated, her voice remaining placid. She held up her contractor's ID badge, clipped to the collar of her coveralls. "Helen Brooks. I'm here to see my son graduate." Miller barely glanced at the ID. His eyes saw the word contractor and janitorial services, and it only confirmed his assessment. He was dealing with a disoriented employee. "Ma'am, I'm sure your son will be very proud of you, but the rules for an event like this are very strict. We have seating charts, security protocols. We can't just have—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at her attire, the broom, her entire being. He didn't want to say "people like you," but the words hung in the air between them. A few families, trickling in late, slowed as they passed, their curiosity piqued by the quiet standoff between the immaculate young officer and the old woman in red. Miller felt their eyes on him, a prickle of irritation on his neck. He was losing control of the entrance. "Look," he said, his voice dropping, trying to create an illusion of privacy. "I don't want to make a scene. Your son, what's his name? I can pass a message along to him after the ceremony." "Ensign Daniel Brooks," Helen said, a flicker of pride warming her voice for the first time. "Right, Ensign Brooks. I'm sure he'll understand. Now if you'll just let me escort you." He took a half-step forward, his hand beginning to lift as if to guide her by the elbow. Helen didn't flinch, but her grip on the broom handle tightened just slightly. The knuckles on her weathered hand were white. "Lieutenant, you are impeding my access to a public naval ceremony to which I have a right to attend," she stated, not as a threat but as a simple declaration of fact. The specific formal language seemed to catch him off guard. "You don't have a guest pass," he countered, regaining his footing. "Everyone needs a guest pass. It's protocol. My son listed me. The name is Helen Brooks. You can check the list." Miller's patience, thin to begin with, finally snapped. He let out an exasperated sigh. "Ma'am, this isn't a negotiation. The Admiral is speaking today. We have security layers. Your equipment," he nodded at the broom, "are a deviation. You're holding up the line. Either you go to the staff entrance, or I will have to call base security to have you removed from the building." He felt a sense of finality, of having laid down the law. But Helen's gaze didn't waver. It was calm, analytical. She had faced down men far more intimidating than this polished young lieutenant, in situations far more dire than a crowded lobby. She was assessing him, his posture, his resolve, the slight tremor of anxiety in his jaw. She had seen that look before, in young men who confused authority with wisdom, who mistook procedure for purpose. He saw her eyes drift down just for a second to his own chest, to the simple gold surface warfare pin gleaming above his ribbons. It was his proudest achievement. Then her eyes returned to his. "Check the list, Lieutenant," she said again, her voice still quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of command. Frustrated and feeling his authority being publicly questioned, Miller decided to end it. He would make a show of checking the list on his tablet, find her name not there or perhaps there, but he would ignore it and then have a legitimate reason for her removal. As he fumbled with the device, his gaze fell on a small tarnished object pinned to the collar of her red coveralls just below her contractor ID. It was a strange-looking thing, a shield with a bomb in the center flanked by 2 lightning bolts and crowned with a wreath. It was dull, made of a pewter-colored metal, its details softened by age and wear. "What is this thing anyway?" he asked, a condescending curiosity in his tone. "Some kind of souvenir you picked up at the exchange?" The question hung in the air. For Helen, the polished hall, the crisp uniforms, the face of the young lieutenant, all of it dissolved for a heartbeat. The scent of floor polish was replaced by the acrid smell of burnt cordite and the metallic tang of fear. The gentle murmur of the crowd became the roaring static in her ears, the frantic, muffled voice of a fellow tech coming through her comms headset. "Helen, talk to me. What do you see?" "This is zero down here." She wasn't in Newport. She was in the murky, freezing water of the Persian Gulf in 1991, her body encased in a heavy dive suit, her hands clumsy in thick gloves, tracing the crude, terrifying shape of a limpet mine clinging to the hull of a U.S. warship. The world was a maelstrom of darkness, pressure, and the rhythmic, amplified sound of her own breathing. That tarnished pin on her collar wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise, a symbol of a moment, one of hundreds where there was no room for error, no one to call for help, and nothing between life and a violent, watery death, but her training, her steady hands, and a will of cold, forged iron. "It's not a souvenir," she said, her voice pulling back from a vast distance. The hall snapped back into focus. Before Miller could respond, a subtle shift occurred in the flow of people entering the hall. A path cleared. Walking through it was Rear Admiral Jennings, the event's guest of honor, flanked by his aide, a young, sharp-eyed commander. Jennings was a man in his late 50s, his face a testament to a life at sea, his uniform adorned with the quiet testament of a long and distinguished career. He was smiling, shaking a hand here, offering a nod there, the very picture of naval grace. His procession moved steadily toward the main doors until, from the corner of his eye, he saw the tableau, the stiff-backed young lieutenant, the old woman in the red coveralls, the broom. He saw the confrontation. It was a minor, unsightly wrinkle in an otherwise perfect morning, and he was about to look away, to let the junior officers handle their business. But then his eyes, trained by decades of scanning horizons and assessing threats, locked onto the small, tarnished pin on Helen's collar. Rear Admiral Jennings stopped. He stopped so abruptly that his aide nearly collided with him. The ceremonial smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, almost shocking stillness. He stared at the pin, his mind racing, flipping through the catalog of insignia he knew as well as his own name. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing, not in suspicion but in dawning, thunderstruck recognition. The shape, the bomb, the lightning bolts, the wreath on top, signifying the highest level of qualification. A Master Explosive Ordnance Disposal badge. He looked from the pin to Helen's face, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the gray hair, the wrinkles, but he also saw the set of her jaw, the unwavering clarity in her eyes, the parade ground posture that no janitorial uniform could disguise. He saw a ghost from another era. His gaze flicked to Lieutenant Miller, to his puffed-up chest and condescending posture. He saw the entire story in a single gut-wrenching glance. The Admiral's face hardened, a cold fury building behind his eyes. He turned to his aide, his voice a low, urgent command that sliced through the lobby's chatter. "Commander, get the base commander on the line. Now, tell him to meet me at the main entrance, and he'd better be running." The aide, startled by the Admiral's intensity, fumbled for his phone. "Aye, sir. What's the issue?" Admiral Jennings didn't take his eyes off Helen. "The issue, Commander, is that one of my officers is about to make the biggest mistake of his career, and tell the CO to pull the service record for a Master Chief Petty Officer Helen Brooks. EOD. Tell him to look for deployments to the Gulf in the early 90s and then Anbar Province, Iraq. Now move." The aide, hearing the names and the tone, paled. He understood. This wasn't a protocol issue. This was something else entirely. As he hurried away, barking into his phone, the Admiral took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself in the background of the confrontation, a silent, powerful witness. The cavalry had been called, and in the hushed, expectant air of the great hall, the storm was about to break. Inside the base command center, a duty officer took the call from the Admiral's aide. The request was so unusual, it bordered on bizarre. The base commander, Captain Wallace, was needed at the OCS graduation hall, on the double, and he was to pull the service record for a contractor. A janitor. "Are you sure you have the name right?" the duty officer asked, typing Helen Brooks into the personnel database. The system cross-referenced active, reserve, and retired records. A file popped up, not a thin contractor profile, but a massive Department of Defense service record, flagged with dozens of classifications. The duty officer's eyes widened. He stood up from his chair. "Sir," he called out to the watch commander, "you need to see this." Captain Wallace was already putting on his cover, annoyed at being pulled from his pre-ceremony duties. when his desk phone buzzed. It was his watch commander, his voice tight with urgency. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. Helen Brooks. She's not just a retired vet. She's a legend." On the screen in the command center, a life of extraordinary danger and quiet professionalism scrolled past. Helen Brooks, enlisted 1982, one of the first women accepted into the Navy's EOD school, a brutal pipeline designed to break the strongest men. She didn't break. She graduated with honors. Deployments flashed across the screen. Panama, 1989. Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, 1991. Attached to a mine countermeasures unit clearing sea lanes under constant threat. Bosnia, 1995. Then, after a decade as a master instructor at the school in Indian Head where she trained hundreds of techs, she voluntarily deployed again. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2005. Anbar Province. Attached to a Marine unit, leading a team disarming the complex, deadly IEDs that were killing Americans every day. The citations were a litany of valor. A bronze star with a V for valor, for defusing a multi-device daisy chain under direct enemy fire, saving an entire platoon. A Purple Heart, from a blast that took the hearing in her left ear. Multiple combat action ribbons, and there at the top of the file, Master Chief Petty Officer, the highest enlisted rank, a position of leadership and reverence earned over 30 years of service. The file noted she retired 7 years ago and took a quiet contracting job on base to be near her only son who had just been accepted into OCS. Captain Wallace grabbed his cover. "Get me my command, Master Chief. We're going to the hall, now." He understood the Admiral's fury. A Master Chief wasn't just a rank, it was an institution. A retired Master Chief, especially one with a record like Helen's, was a piece of living history, and one of his lieutenants was treating her like a trespasser. Back in the lobby, Lieutenant Miller was oblivious to the seismic shift happening behind the scenes. He had seen the Admiral arrive but assumed the great man was simply waiting for the ceremony to begin. Miller's world was small, confined to the task at hand. His patience was gone. "Ma'am, I have given you every opportunity," he said, his voice now cold and hard. "This is a secure military event. That pin," he gestured dismissively at the Master EOD badge, "is considered fraudulent wear on a civilian uniform. It is a violation of the Stolen Valor Act. I am ordering you to remove it and escorting you from the premises. If you refuse, I will have you detained." It was the ultimate overreach, an accusation born of pure, arrogant ignorance. He was accusing a hero of pretending to be one, all while standing in the house she had helped build, in the Navy she had defended with her life. He took another step forward, and this time, he put his hand on her arm. It was like touching granite. She didn't move, didn't even seem to register his touch. Her eyes, however, left his, and looked over his shoulder. A shadow had fallen over them. The great oak doors of the hall swung open with a resounding thud. Captain Wallace, the base commander, entered, moving with a velocity that seemed to bend the air around him. At his side was his command Master Chief, a man whose face looked like it was carved from a block of shipyard steel. Behind them, 2 more senior officers followed. They moved as a single unstoppable unit, their eyes locked on the scene in the alcove. The crowd parted before them, the whispers dying into a stunned, absolute silence. Lieutenant Miller saw them coming. His chest swelled with relief and vindication. The CO was here to back his play, to restore order. He straightened his posture, ready to give his report. But the delegation didn't stop at him. They walked right past him as if he were a piece of furniture. Captain Wallace came to a halt 2 paces in front of Helen Brooks. He looked at the old woman in the faded red coveralls, at her weathered hands, at the tarnished pin on her collar, and at the unshakable dignity in her eyes. He didn't speak. He simply brought his hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise it seemed to cut the air. The silence in the hall deepened, becoming heavy, profound. Every eye was fixed on the unbelievable sight. A full Navy captain, the commander of the entire naval station, saluting the janitor. The command Master Chief next to him snapped to attention and rendered his own salute. The other officers followed suit. Lieutenant Miller stood frozen, his hand still hovering near Helen's arm. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a violation of every protocol he had ever learned. Officers don't salute enlisted personnel first. They certainly don't salute civilian contractors. Then Captain Wallace spoke, his voice ringing with a power that filled the vast space, each word a hammer blow of truth. "Master Chief Brooks," he said, his eyes holding hers with profound respect. "Forgive this disruption. It is an honor to have you with us today." He held the salute for a moment longer, then crisply dropped his hand. He turned, not fully to the crowd but enough to include everyone, his gaze sweeping over the seated families, the graduating officers, and finally landing, with the force of a physical impact, on Lieutenant Miller. For those of you who may not be aware, Captain Wallace began, his voice taking on the cadence of a formal citation. You are in the presence of a living legend. This is Master Chief Petty Officer Helen Brooks, United States Navy, retired. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. In the formation on stage, Ensign Daniel Brooks's head snapped up, his eyes finding his mother. He knew she had been in the Navy, of course, but he thought she had been a supply clerk, or something quiet, something safe. Master Chief, he had no idea. This woman, the captain continued, his voice rising, was one of the first women to ever earn the right to wear the EOD crab. She cleared mines from the shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf when half the sailors in this room hadn't been born yet. She deployed to the mountains of Bosnia and the deserts of Iraq. She spent 20 months in Anbar province, walking toward the very things everyone else runs from. She personally disarmed over 200 improvised explosive devices. The captain paused, letting the number sink in. 200 times she had faced death in its most intimate and violent form. The pin that my lieutenant here dismissed as a souvenir is the Master Explosive Ordnance Disposal Warfare Device. It is earned with sweat, with brains, and with a courage that few people will ever comprehend. Master Chief Brooks didn't just serve, she led, she taught. There are men and women serving in the fleet today, alive and whole because she was their instructor, because she drilled into them the focus and the discipline required to survive. She served this Navy with honor and distinction for 30 years. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Daniel Brooks in the formation. And today she is not here as a Master Chief. She is here as a mother, a proud mother, here to watch her son Ensign Daniel Brooks follow in her footsteps and join the long line of service she so nobly represents. The silence broke. It started with a single person clapping, then another, and then the entire hall, families, graduates, and officers rose to their feet in a thunderous rolling wave of applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a deep, heartfelt roar of respect and awe for the unassuming woman in the red coveralls. Helen stood still amidst the storm, her expression unchanged, though a faint blush colored her cheeks. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the captain. Then the captain's gaze returned to Lieutenant Miller. The warmth and respect vanished, replaced by a glacial cold. His voice dropped, but it was more menacing in its quiet intensity than his public address had been. Lieutenant Miller, my office, 1500 hours. You will explain to me, in detail, how your rigid adherence to what you thought was protocol made you blind. You looked at this Master Chief and you saw a uniform. You saw gray hair. You saw a woman. And you made an assumption. You failed to see the bearing. You failed to see the lifetime of honor standing right in front of you. That, Lieutenant, is not just a procedural error. It is a catastrophic failure of leadership. You are dismissed. Miller, pale and trembling, could only stammer, "Aye, aye, sir." He turned and practically fled from the hall. As the applause began to subside, Helen finally spoke. She looked at Captain Wallace, but her words were meant for the lesson Miller had failed to learn. "Captain," she said, her voice soft but carrying. "The lieutenant was trying to enforce the standards. That's not a bad thing. The standards protect us all." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the young faces in the graduating class, including her son's. "The only thing that matters is that you apply them fairly, to everyone. You don't soften them for anyone, and you don't weaponize them against someone because they don't look the part. Experience doesn't expire when you get old. And gray hair doesn't mean you've gone soft. It just means you've survived the things that broke other people." As she spoke those words, a final, fleeting image filled her mind. Not of war or of a bomb, but of something quieter. She was younger, a chief petty officer then, standing in the Anbar Desert under a blistering sun. A terrified young Marine, barely 20 years old, was refusing to get back in his vehicle after his friend had been killed by an IED the day before. Helen had walked over, not with orders or threats, but with a canteen of water. She sat with him in the dust and she talked. She told him about fear, about how it was just a tool, and how you had to pick it up and use it before it used you. She didn't leave his side until he stood up, nodded, and got back in the truck. That, more than any bomb she'd disarmed, was what the pin on her collar meant. It was about taking care of your people. The ceremony began. Helen was not escorted to a staff area, but to a seat in the front row, right next to Rear Admiral Jennings. The Admiral leaned over and whispered, "It's been a long time, Master Chief. I was a lieutenant on the USS Tripoli during Desert Storm. You and your team cleared a mine that would have sent us to the bottom. I never forgot that." Helen simply nodded. "Just doing my job, sir." The moment came when the new ensigns were called to the stage. Daniel Brooks's name was announced. He walked across the stage, his movements crisp, his face a mask of pride and overwhelming emotion. He received his commission, shook the Admiral's hand, and then, breaking with protocol, he didn't return to his seat. He walked down the steps and directly to his mother. He stopped before her. He looked at the woman who had raised him, the woman he thought was a quiet, humble janitor, and he saw her for the first time, a warrior, a leader, a master chief. His eyes filled with tears. He brought his hand up and gave his mother his first salute as a commissioned officer. Helen Brooks stood slowly, the retired master chief, the janitor, the mother. She returned her son's salute, her form as perfect as it had been 30 years before. The gesture was a bridge across time, a transfer of duty, a circle of service made complete. Weeks later, a new mandatory training module was rolled out across the naval station. It was titled Beyond the Uniform, Recognizing Honor in All Its Forms, and it included specific sections on unconscious bias related to age and gender, using a de-identified case study that everyone understood. Lieutenant Miller was in the front row of the first session, his notebook open, his face humbled and attentive. One afternoon, Helen was in the base commissary, pushing a cart and deciding between two brands of coffee. Master Chief Brooks, she turned. It was Miller in his working uniform, no longer a crisp officer of the deck, but just a young man. He looked nervous. "I wanted to apologize," he stammered, "since there's no excuse for my behavior. I was arrogant, and I was wrong, deeply wrong." Helen looked at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she gave a slight nod of acceptance. "You were, Lieutenant, but you've learned from it. That's what matters." She picked up a can of coffee and put it in her cart. "I had a young tech on my team once, cocky kid, thought he knew everything. On his first real job, he nearly got us all killed because he didn't listen. After I was done screaming him raw, you know what he did? He became the best tech I ever had. Humility is a hard lesson, but it's a good one." She offered him a small, rare smile. "You'll be a fine officer, Lieutenant. Just keep your eyes open." With that, she turned and pushed her cart down the aisle. Just another shopper in the commissary. The quiet hero hiding in plain sight, her duty done, her legacy secure. If Helen's story of quiet courage and unshakable dignity moved you, show your support by liking this video. Share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to She Chose Valor for more stories honoring the women who served.